Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my January wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of January. So I read 11 things in the month of January. One of them was the unpublished novel of a friend of mine, so I can't talk about that here, though perhaps I will be able to at some point in the future. But for now, I have 10 things that I can talk to you about. For a quick check-in on my goals, out of the 10 things I read, 5 of them were books I had physical copies of, which is not maybe as many as I would like to, but I also read 2 audiobooks, 2 library books, and 1 book that I had on Kindle already. I did read a couple of non-Victorian classics, which pleases me, and I also did read the book that was from my TBR challenge this month, so that's good. But yes, anyway, on to the 10 books I read in the month of January. So this month I read 4 classics, only one of which was Victorian, which pleased me, although out of the other 3, 2 of them were written by people who were also alive in the Victorian period, but just happened to write these books after the Victorian period had ended, but that's beside the point. To begin with, the Victorian novel I read in January, that was Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and this was a reread for me. This was, I think, my 3rd reading, though it might only be my 2nd, I'm not sure. Regardless, I haven't read it since I was a teenager, so it was lovely to read it again. I read this as part of my Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course series that I do on this channel, where every 3 months I talk about 2 Victorian novels and a particular theme that runs in both of them in kind of more analytical terms and in a slightly longer video. Video featuring Far from the Madding Crowd and comparing it to Wuthering Heights and how both of these books deal with rural landscape is already up, and I will link it down below. But it was really, really lovely to reread Far from the Madding Crowd. It's one of my favourite Thomas Hardy novels, and I love Thomas Hardy's writing, and I think this book is so good and so interesting and so enjoyable. It's about a woman called Bathsheba Everdeen who inherits a farm and decides that she's going to run the farm herself, despite the fact that she is a woman and that in the Victorian period it's quite uncommon to find women running their own farms. And the book is partly about her experience running this farm and partly about 3 men who are kind of vying for her affections. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I think it's one of Hardy's best, and it's definitely one of my favourite. It's probably my 2nd favourite after Jude the Obscure. I have done a full video review of this in the past, which I'll link down below, but there's a lot I love about this book. I find the ending really, really perfect. One of those Hardy endings that really gives you quite a mix of feelings. The characters are very, very strong. I find Bathsheba a very interesting character, and I find the way this book deals with themes of madness, with themes of relationships, with themes of power and themes of work and the place of women within Victorian society just really, really interesting. So yeah, definitely one I'd recommend. In January, I also finished off the Sherlock Holmes series by listening to the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, which is the final short story collection in the Sherlock Holmes collection. Nick and I have been listening to the Sherlock Holmes audiobook narrated by Stephen Fry over the last like 6 to 7 months, and we finally came to the end of it in January, which is weird because we've been listening to Stephen Fry read Sherlock Holmes for quite a long time. Really, really enjoyed the Sherlock Holmes series. In general, I'm a much bigger fan of the short stories than I am of the individual novels, but this last collection was really good and enjoyable. Interesting to have a few short stories in there that weren't narrated by Watson as well, but there were some lovely, lovely moments. I really enjoy the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and there were some great stories in this collection, like there are in so many of them. Another early 20th century classic I read this month was Albert Nobbs by George Moore. George Moore, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was alive and writing during the Victorian period. They also carried on afterwards, and I've read one other book by George Moore before, which was Drama and Muslin, which I read during Victober. I'll link down my wrap-up for that below, but I found Drama and Muslin very interesting, and I was keen to read more by him, and someone suggested in the comments of one of my videos that I might like to read Albert Nobbs, and that it might interest me as being quite a different book. So Albert Nobbs was written in 1918, and it is set in the 1860s in the Victorian period, and it is possibly one of the first transgender novels, possibly not. It is either about a transgender man or about a lesbian woman who lives her life as a man and wears men's clothing in order to get more money because men are paid much better in the Victorian period. It's not quite clear whether Albert really views herself as being a man or a woman, and the pronouns used kind of vary whether it's from her perspective or from outsider's perspective. So when it's from someone else's perspective, George Moore uses he, but when it's from her perspective, he uses she, so I will use she in this video. And also the term transgender in general is kind of anachronistic for something written in 1918. Albert Nobbs says that she doesn't feel like she's a man or a woman. She feels like she is somehow in between, and that she doesn't really fit into either of these gender binaries, which is very, very interesting for a book written 100 years ago. There were some things that I didn't like about this book. In general, I would say I didn't love the plot, and I found the ending a bit odd. And it was quite hard to tell how Albert was being presented, because there were times when Albert is an incredibly sympathetic character, and there are other times when Albert comes across as being sort of a miser who's really, really obsessed with money and doesn't really care about people very much. George Moore kind of suggests throughout the book that the fact that Albert kind of isn't really a man or a woman is something that means that Albert is left out of society a lot, and it's difficult to say whether that is a criticism of Albert or of society. Although there were some things I didn't love about the book, and although there were some things about the plot that I struggled with, at the same time, it's a book written 100 years ago that deals with really, really interesting issues, and it's very, very, very historically interesting to read, especially in the way it deals with Albert not really feeling that she belongs in either gender, and also in the way that it deals with Albert's attraction to women, because Albert effectively decides in this book that she's lonely and that she should get married, but she doesn't want to marry a man, so what if she were to marry a woman? And so she starts thinking about women in a different way. So it's a really, really interesting book. I wouldn't say it's like the best read I've ever had. I didn't think it was as well written as Drama and Muslin by George Moore, but I thought it was really, really interesting, fascinating read, especially because it was written 100 years ago. So I know that there is also a film of Albert Nobbs, so I'd quite like to see that as well, because I think it would be quite interesting. But yeah, a really interesting read, certainly. And then I read The Sitford Mystery by Agatha Christie, which I got out from the library. I really like Agatha Christie, and it's always a joy to read her works. They're really, really enjoyable, very quick reads for me. Like, I read this in 2 days. I really, really love her writing, her characterization. I love the fact that her books are so dialogue heavy, because it's just really, really enjoyable to read. This wasn't my favourite one, but I think that's kind of nothing to do with the book itself in a way. I have previously seen the television adaptation of The Sitford Mystery, and a big adaptation of The Sitford Mystery was always like my favourite Miss Marple or Poirot film or television adaptation when I was growing up. I've seen it lots of times, I own the DVD, I really, really loved it. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to read The Sitford Mystery, the book. And I knew it was very different. I know, for example, the television adaptation has Miss Marple in, and the book is a standalone Agatha Christie. It does not have Miss Marple in. And so I knew it would be different, but I don't think I really appreciated quite how different it is. It's very, very, very different, which meant that I was slightly disappointed with it overall, because I was expecting some of the things that I love about the television adaptation to be in the book, and then they weren't in the book, and I was a bit sad. But Sitford Mystery deals with the death of a man called Captain Trevelyan, who is murdered, and people start to try and work out what's going on. Captain Trevelyan's nephew, who would have stood to gain from Captain Trevelyan's death, is immediately arrested. And then his fiancée Emily decides that she is going to try and find out what really happened, because she doesn't think that her fiancé Jim did it. And so we follow Emily and a journalist called Charles as they try and put together the case and solve and work out what really happened. So a very enjoyable Agatha Christie, as her books always were, but I found it a little bit disappointing because I'd seen the television adaptation first and was kind of expecting that, and then got something very different. Moving on to some more modern novels, another thing I got out of the library this month was Tin Man by Sarah Winman. You've probably heard quite a lot about Tin Man already on BookTube because a lot of people loved it last year. It follows the story of two men, Ellis and Michael, who have been friends since they were teenagers. We start off in the first half of the book with Ellis's narrative and move later on to get to see things from Michael's perspective. Ellis lost his wife 5 years ago, and his half of the narrative explores his grief and also his memories of the past, his relationship with his wife Annie, and also his friendship with Michael, which was a very deep friendship but at times also strayed into more. Later on we find out more about Michael's life, his relationship with Ellis, his experience as a gay man during the 1980s AIDS crisis, and so on. When I picked it up, I was kind of expecting that either I would think it was absolutely incredible or I would be really, really disappointed and not understand what all the hype was about. And actually I'm just kind of in the middle. It was a really good book that I really enjoyed. I don't think it will be one of my favourite books forever. It was very enjoyable to read, and there were points in it that were really moving, but I don't think it will actually stay with me that much. But for me, I don't think it quite packed the same punch as it did for quite a lot of other people. I think one of the slight issues I had with it was that I liked the writing and the voice in Ellis's section more than I did in Michael's section, and I found Michael's voice a little frustrating at times, but I found the substance of the plot and what was being talked about more interesting in the Michael section. So both the sections I really liked, but I didn't love either of them completely because there was kind of something that was letting them down. However, I think the characterization is really, really strong. I loved Annie as a character so much, and I think the relationship between Ellis, Michael and Annie was really, really interesting. I think the book deals with some really interesting issues. I think it deals very well with grief and friendship, and the bits in the second half of the book about the AIDS crisis were really, really interesting. So I think it was a really good book and I would recommend it, but I don't think it made quite the same massive impact on me as it did on a lot of other booktubers. But a book that did make a massive impact on me that I'm sure will end up being on my favourite books of the year was The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. This was amazing and I loved it a lot. And this was one that I'd heard quite mixed things about on BookTube and everywhere, and I don't quite understand why, because for me this is a brilliant, brilliant book. I'd been meaning to read The Miniaturist for a long, long time, and I was finally pushed to do it because the BBC was showing a television adaptation of it that I really wanted to see, and I wanted to read it first. So I did manage to read this at the beginning of January and then watch the television adaptation, which I really liked as well as the book. and I thought this was absolutely fantastic. It follows a woman called Nella who's 18 years old, and she's just got married to a man a bit older than herself, and she moves into his house where he lives with his sister and 2 servants, one of whom is a black man, which is quite rare for Amsterdam in the 17th century, which is when this book is set. Petronella finds her new sister-in-law difficult to deal with. She finds the household situation and setup a bit odd. She finds that the servants speak more bluntly to her than she expected, and she finds that married life is really, really not what she was expecting it to be, and that her husband does not behave in the way that she expected him to. And then her husband gives her as a wedding present a miniature house, a giant doll's house that he suggests that she can fill in order to have something to do with her time. And so she starts paying a miniaturist to make small things for her house, and then things start arriving from the miniaturist that represent things that the miniaturist really couldn't possibly know about, and so on and so forth. I love this a lot. I heard mixed things about it when a lot of people were reading it a few years ago, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't love it is because they were expecting it to be very magic realist because of the kind of miniaturist element, and actually is not. I like the element of the miniaturist, but that's not the most important thing in this book. I think it works. I don't think it should be sort of taken out or anything like that, but for me, the miniaturist is kind of an interesting backdrop, and there are a lot more really fascinating things going on in this book to do with the relationships between different characters, to do with really interesting themes that I can't really talk about because I think they are twists in a way. The plot in this is so good. There are so many twists, some of which I spotted coming, some of which I absolutely didn't. And it's really, really engaging, and it's wonderful, and the relationships between the characters in these books, between Nella and her husband, between Nella and her sister-in-law Marin, who is a brilliant, brilliant character, and also her relationships with Otto and Cordelia, the 2 servants in the house. I think this book is such a brilliant character study, but it also has a really gripping plot. I read it very, very quickly because I was on the edge of my seat waiting to see what was going to happen. It's historically fascinating, and it's just an absolutely wonderful book. I would highly, highly recommend it. Don't go into it expecting lots of magic realism, but go into it expecting something better because it's great and you should really read it if you haven't. And if you were put off because there were lots of mixed reviews, then seriously, this book is really, really good. One of the best historical fiction books I've read. So yeah, this was a great one. This was a great one. And another favourite of the year so far, perhaps, was Dictator by Robert Harris. This is the 3rd book in the Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris, which are, again, historical fiction following the figure of Cicero, who was a real-life person in ancient Rome. The trilogy as a whole follows Cicero's life and his political career, which coincides time-wise with sort of the rise of Julius Caesar. And it's so good. So much happens in that 3rd book. It's incredibly dramatic, incredibly exciting. It packs such a long period of time and so many important events into one book, but it's absolutely brilliantly written, really, really engaging, and just wonderful, wonderful book. I listened to this on audiobook. Really, really recommend them if you like historical fiction. You don't have to think you're interested in ancient Rome, because I wouldn't in general have said that I was that fussed about Roman history, but this trilogy have made me much more interested in Roman history. I can't say too much about this individual book because it's part of the trilogy, but it's absolutely wonderful. So, so good. I can't recommend that series enough. Just so engaging, so enjoyable in terms of the characterisation and the exploration of political issues in Roman history, and yeah, really, really great. Really, really great books. I then read 2 short story collections. I did say that this year I wanted to read a few more short story collections than I had done last year, so I thought I would start off with 2 this month, neither of which I have to say I liked quite as much as I was expecting to, but there we go. First I read Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman. This was really interesting, and I partly read it because I had heard that it was quite similar to Some by David Eagleman, which was a book I really enjoyed last year. Some consists of 40 very short stories which deal with various possible afterlives, I suppose. Einstein's Dreams has a sort of similar premise. It says on the cover that it's a novel, but it is really a collection of short stories, but it's framed by a fictionalization of Einstein, and the idea is that the short stories in this book are his dreams, in which the author explores different ways that time could work and how different alternative possible worlds would operate if time worked differently there. I enjoyed this, I thought it was good, but my main feeling on reading it was that it was less good than Some, but very similar, and so I would recommend reading Some by David Eagleman over this. I felt that Some felt a bit more fully fleshed out, and in quite a lot of the worlds and the different times that Alan Lightman presented, I didn't quite see how they worked. I think there are lots of people who have enjoyed it more than me, and it wasn't that I didn't like it, it was a good book. there was something slightly lacking for me and I didn't feel I connected with it or found the stories quite as fascinating as I did in some. Next, I read A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. I did enjoy this one, but I have to say I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I enjoyed The Gracekeepers or The Rental Heart and Other Stories, which are her other two books. Portable Shelter is a short story collection, and like Einstein's Dreams, it does have a kind of framing device. The basic premise of A Portable Shelter is that there are two women, Ruth and Liska, and they're about to have their first child. Ruth is pregnant, and they've promised each other that they're not going to tell stories to the baby because they're only going to tell it the truth. But while the other one is sleeping, they tell stories to their unborn baby. The stories we get in this are the stories they tell to their unborn child. The thing about this book, I think, was that I really loved the frame and I really loved the stories, but I don't really think they work together. I think the frame is really, really beautiful. I love the bits where Ruth and Liska talk about expecting their new baby and what their new baby might be like and the love they already feel for their new child. I thought those bits were beautifully written and really, really lovely. And there are a lot of these stories that I really, really enjoyed. I think my favourite would have to be Flint, which I thought was a great story, but several of the others I enjoyed too. The issue is that none of these stories are stories you would tell to a child because they're all like slightly horrific and a lot of them have a lot of swearing and sex in, so you wouldn't tell that to your unborn baby. And also the two women, the mothers, talk about how they're telling these stories to their unborn child because these stories have morals in, have messages to give their child. But I didn't feel like any of these stories really had morals. So for me, the frame and the stories don't really fit together. I like both, but they don't really seem to make one whole thing for me. So I enjoyed this, but I think I prefer Kirsty Logan's other two books, but I would recommend her as a writer because I think she's a very strong writer. It's just that this one didn't quite work as well for me. Finally, I also read one non-fiction book in the month of January, and that is this, Jane Austen, The Secret Radical by Helena Kelly. I have such mixed feelings on this book. Such mixed feelings. Such mixed feelings, in fact, that I did not give this a star rating on Goodreads, which is the first time I've ever not done this because I just couldn't give it a rating. This was very kindly sent to me as a review copy by Icon Books, and I have so many thoughts on this that I think I'm probably going to make an individual review on it. Because I kind of disagreed with pretty much everything that Helena Kelly said in this book about Jane Austen, but also I kind of loved it and loved the reading experience and loved getting really angry about the fact that I disagreed with everything she said. So that was also a positive thing. I haven't read literary criticism for years, not since I finished university really, and I flew through this in 2 or 3 days despite the fact it's not that thin and it's fairly dense, because I was really, really enjoying reading literary criticism again, and especially because I disagreed with a lot of what Helena Kelly said, it made me think about why I disagreed with it and what my arguments would be in response and so on, which is what literary criticism is kind of for and is really, really nice. It also made me desperate to reread some Jane Austen, so I'm hoping I'll reread some Jane Austen in February. And also, although I completely disagree with a lot of Helena Kelly's arguments, you can also really tell that she loves Jane Austen, and that makes me very happy. Like I said, I think I'm going to do an individual video on this and talk a bit more about her arguments, but I think the main thing I sort of disagree with in this is that I don't think Jane Austen was that radical. I made a video last year called How Modern is Jane Austen, which I'll link down below, in which I talked about the fact that one of the reasons why I love Jane Austen is that she is early 19th century through and through, and that although she does explore some things which were quite radical for the time, she's also quite conservative in other ways, and that's why she's interesting. That's one of the things I like about her. And I disagree with the kind of premise of this book as well as a lot of the individual arguments. Leaving aside my opinions for a moment, I do think there are some holes in the arguments she makes, and she does extrapolate quite a lot from small things to suggest much bigger things in a way which I sometimes think is not really plausible. But at the same time, this book is so much infused with a love for Jane Austen, and there are so many interesting things to think about, even though I disagree with a lot of them, that I kind of loved the reading experience of it. So that's why I didn't give it a star rating on Goodreads, and that is why I'm probably going to make an individual review as well to talk about the arguments in more detail, because there are a lot of arguments I would like to pick holes in, but also it kind of delighted me to read because I love Jane Austen a lot, and she loves Jane Austen a lot too, and that's nice. So that's it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of January. Please do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Also, let me know what you've been reading this month and what your best read of January was. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.